The act that spelled the end of communism and Russia's worst crisis since the revolution. How will Boris Yeltsin be remembered? This is Inside Story. Hello, I'm David Foster. The West hailed him as a champion of freedom. To millions of ordinary Russians, he was the man who threw away their empire. The death of Boris Yeltsin has brought mixed emotions in his homeland. To many of his mourners, he's the hero who brought down the Soviet Union, claiming democracy and capitalism for the world's biggest country. Others cite the years of turmoil that followed, riven with economic hardship. Most agree, though, that his 8 years in power were a huge turning point in Russian history. So what will his legacy be?
From a hero of democracy, raising his fist to see off an attempted coup, to embarrassing stumbles, Yeltsin was always a flamboyant leader. He ruled Russia from 1991 till 1999, overseeing the death of the Soviet Union and the birth of a democratic Russia. His legacy will be debated for years to come. But in the area of the economy, Yeltsin pushed for market reform and ending price fixing, driving inflation up by 2,000% until the government rebelled. The crisis culminated in Yeltsin dissolving the parliament. MPs then responded by refusing to leave the building. For the second time in his career, the deadlock was broken by tanks. They pounded the building until the leaders of the attempted coup were arrested. It wasn't the last time Yeltsin resorted to violence. In Chechnya, Yeltsin's attempts to put down a rebellion cemented this region as a flashpoint for conflict that continues today. Yeltsin accepted democracy, but still manipulated it to remain in power, relying on his family and multimillionaire businessmen to call the shots in the new Russia. But in retirement, the exhibitionist leader virtually disappeared from public view.
Well, joining us now from Moscow, Dmitry Babich, a leading journalist and political analyst who writes for Russia Profile. And from London, Martin Macaulay, a specialist in Russian history and politics, the author of numerous studies of Russia and the Soviet Union. Dmitry Babich, first of all, in just a moment I'd like to explore Yeltsin's personality, but first of all, what do you believe should be written on his tombstone?
I think the following phrase: the man whom Russia loved once. Maybe I would also add, great disillusionment only follows true love.
Martin Macaulay? I think you're a great success, but also a great failure. A man who promised much, but in the end delivered very little.
So what, Martin, were the contradictions in Yeltsin?
Well, first of all, he was a liberal by instinct, and that's very important. A liberal leader in Russia is a phenomenon. Normally, Russian leaders are conservative. They concentrate power at the center. Yeltsin was a populist. He was very good at going to the people. He wanted the people to participate and so on. Therefore, you could say he began on the path to democracy. Economically, unfortunately, he got very bad advice. Shock therapy in 1992 was a disaster. And then you had the 1998 financial crisis, financial failure, when the new middle class was decimated. So therefore, economically, the results were very, very poor. And had there been free elections, 1996, for instance, the presidential election, the communist candidate Zyuganov actually won. But of course, it all depended on who counted the votes, and Yeltsin was declared the victor. So therefore, the people had fallen out of love with him by the middle 1990s. And then he handed on his legacy to President Putin, who's been very lucky because of rising oil and gas prices and commodity prices. Had oil and gas prices been as high in the early 1990s as 10 years later, 15 years later, then Yeltsin probably would have been a great success, because a huge amount of money would have flowed into the country. But he was very unlucky because oil and gas prices were low, and therefore and the state couldn't collect taxes. Therefore, social services floundered and so on. And the people who will look back with most affection will be the small liberal middle class, the intelligentsia, those who many of them have Western values and so on. But the vast majority of Russians will say he was an enormous disappointment, and now compare that era to the new Putin era. We much prefer Putin.
Dmitry Babbage, when he said, Yeltsin said in his resignation speech, people believe that we'd be able to jump from the grey, stagnating totalitarian past into a bright, rich and civilised future in one go. And I myself believed that. Was it because he was a victim of circumstance, or was he naive?
Well, to be frank with you, I don't think Yeltsin was a failure. Life in Russia in the 90s was no bed of roses, but it was destined to be so. I mean, both Gorbachev and Yeltsin could not be entirely successful presidents because Russia had to go through economic crisis. There was no other way we could reform our economy, which hasn't changed much since Stalin's times. It was based on the same principles in the late 80s as in the early 50s. And isolation from the West was also inevitable. As we see now, the West doesn't particularly like us, with Yeltsin or with Putin or with anyone else. So the best thing Gorbachev and Yeltsin could do was to alleviate the pain, to sugar the pill of humiliation. But they could not be entirely successful presidents because the system was unreformed.
I'd like to go into his legacy and what he may or may not have achieved for his country a little bit later on. But in terms of his personality, I'm left wondering, looking at the pictures, whether he was shrewd or simple. And when I say simple, I mean not a complicated person.
Well, I must tell you that the image of Yeltsin as a bumbling bear is a wrong image. He was very cunning politically. He outwitted all of his enemies, some very smart men among them. And also, you know, I remember talking to his head of his protocol service, Mr. Shevchenko, who worked with both him and Gorbachev. And Shevchenko said that Gorbachev was late very often, and Putin is now late very often. Yeltsin was never late. So this idea of him being a careless, he might be careless in details, but he was very responsible in important things.
But he appeared to be a very heavy drinker, and there were those who suggested that this affected his work.
Well, he was a man of the people. That was part of his charisma. I once interviewed the head of Yeltsin's press service, Kostikov, with whom Yeltsin quarreled badly, so Kostikov had no reason to love him. But Kostikov told me there was never a spark of love between Gorbachev and the simple folk. Only intellectuals loved Gorbachev, and probably Westerners. But there was a spark of love between Yeltsin and the people, because people perceived him as one of their own. Maybe drinking was part of that.
Martin Macaulay, you edited Gorbachev's English memoirs, and you've said to me that you were surprised at how nice he was, probably too nice to be a leader of the Soviet Union. What would you say of Yeltsin's personality in that vein?
He was a real Russian, and he was very cunning. And somebody from his background, his origins and so on, he achieved a lot. And you can only get to a position like that if you are cunning, if you can outfox people, and he did that. His tragedy was that his health began to deteriorate. And because of that, then he was taking drugs, and he had a bypass operation. He drank a lot to relieve the pain and so on. And his judgment was then clouded. And because of that, power, if you like, then slipped away to those around him, and to people like Chubais and others, who manipulated him. And then you had the oligarchs like Berezovsky, who was very close to Yeltsin's family and so on. If you like, the business elite became very powerful, and in many ways they got involved in politics, and they took some of the decision-making away from Yeltsin.
And was this,
I had the impression
if I may interrupt, just tackle you on this one point, was this the time when Yeltsin's wife, Naina, went on television and begged for some understanding for her family when they were implicated in financial scandals?
Yes, well, the period when he declines is after 1996. He was re-elected president in 1996. We now know that the communist Zyuganov won the election, but it didn't really matter because Zyuganov didn't want to become president. And after that, if you like, he was a president in waiting. He was a president in the shadows. disappeared from time to time. His wife did come forward, and there were various scandals and so on associated with the leadership, and you had a situation where he wasn't really in control. He wasn't a strong leader. Decisions would be taken by others. If you look at the number of prime ministers, it's a merry-go-round, and really desperate attempt to find a prime minister to run the country. He couldn't get a majority in Parliament. He had to bribe Parliament to get legislation through. They tried to impeach him and so on. And Russia, I would say, needed a strong leader. If you go back to Russia in the 1990s, the lesson is that you don't reform economically and politically, and this is a mistake that Gorbachev also made. You don't reform economically and politically at the same time. The classic example here is China and Vietnam. The communist parties there have retained the monopoly of political power, but they have thriving, successful market economies underway. Now, it's possible that China and Vietnam can do that, and perhaps Russia could not have done that, but that's obviously the way forward. And so there was an alternative to the Gorbachev and Yeltsin era. But of course, when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the economy collapsed as well, and they took American advice, shock therapy and so on. And looking back on it, it was very bad advice. The state should have played a much more important role in managing the economy, and the institutions should have been built up. Yeltsin more or less handed it over to Gaidar. Yeltsin had very little interest in economics and couldn't really grasp economic theory, and handed it over to Gaidar and others. Well, and then at the end of the day, Gaidar didn't deliver.
So Martin, if at this point I could just bring Dmitry back in. Igor Gaidar, who had led the democratic opposition to the Chechenian war, and he publicly broke with Yeltsin over this. He said, "The victory is ours," about the fall of the Soviet Union. For me, Yeltsin is a tool of history.
Well, in a way, Yeltsin was a tool of history, and I wouldn't judge the situation in Russia in the 90s and now only in negative terms. The fact that China and Vietnam didn't have a political reform and that they had only economic reform doesn't mean that they have less corruption than Russia does. They probably have more, it's just not reported in the press. In Russia, you can say it openly. In Vietnam or in China, you will have some difficulties criticizing the government as a whole.
So very difficult.
Gaidar?
I was just going to say, so very difficult to separate the personality from what he's achieved. But we're going to take a break, and when we come back, we're going to look at what Gorbachev's legacy actually is, how Russia changed, and the role that Boris Yeltsin played in shaping its image. Do stay with us on Inside Story.